Please welcome Hal Newman.
Good morning, and thanks for the privilege of speaking with you all. Good morning. I didn't expect to end up in a confession booth, but that's exactly what this became. And I say that as someone who's lived this work from the front line, not just as a paramedic, but now in a very different way, still inside it. Let me explain how I got there. I run The Last Ambulance. It's an independent publication focused on the emergency pre-hospital care system. Paramedics, dispatchers, the people who show up when everything else has already gone wrong. It's not institutional. It's not filtered through layers of approval. And because of that, people tell me things that they don't tell anyone else. They write when they feel unheard, when they feel stuck, when something has happened that they can't quite process and they don't know where to put it. And alongside that, I work with the Canadian Paramedic Memorial Foundation, which is a very different kind of work, but it touches the same nerve. Because when you build a national monument for paramedics and emergency medical dispatchers, and for everyone who delivers emergency medical care, you're not just building something symbolic, you're opening a door. And people walk through that door carrying memories, reflections, anger, helplessness, frustration, betrayal, and the profound weight of grief. Grief for colleagues, grief for patients, grief for moments that didn't end the way they should have, and they bring that to you. They share names, stories, things they've never said out loud. So between those two worlds, one focused on storytelling, the other on reflection and remembrance, I found myself in a place where people come to say what they've been holding on to. And that's when I realized this isn't just communication. It's the confession booth at the Church of EMS. People don't write when things are fine. They write when something is broken. And when they do, they don't send polished thoughts. They don't send policy suggestions. They don't send tidy narratives. They send what they've been carrying, sometimes for years, often for decades. And often they start with a line that stops me cold. I've never told anyone this before. At first, I thought I understood my role. Through The Last Ambulance, I was an independent journalist, sharing stories, highlighting issues, giving people a voice. And through the Canadian Paramedic Memorial Foundation, I was brought in as a storyteller, helping shape how we remember, how we honor the profession, how we give meaning to what has been lost. Two different roles, at least that's what I thought. But at some point, something shifted. I wasn't just telling stories. I was listening at scale across both of these worlds. And the volume of what I was hearing, well, it started to feel familiar in a way I couldn't place. Until one day it clicked. This isn't a media platform, and this isn't just storytelling. It really is a confession booth. People come in quietly, they close the door, and they finally say the things that they've been holding on to. Not because they expect it to fix anything, but because they need someone to hear it. And once you start hearing those stories, you don't get to unhear them. It's not one story. That would be easier. If it was one patient, one call, one moment, you could process it. You could file it somewhere in your mind and move forward. But this is different. It's hundreds of stories, and over time, they start to sound the same in ways that should scare us. Not identical, but connected. Threads of exhaustion, of moral injury, of people trying to do the right thing inside systems that don't always make that possible. And what strikes me most is not just what people say, it's how they say it. There's a kind of quiet in these messages, not calm, not peace, resignation. People who have stopped expecting to be heard, finally speaking anyway, and trusting that maybe, just maybe, this time, someone will listen. But here's the part we don't talk about enough. Listening like this leaves a mark. We talk about compassion fatigue as something that happens on the front lines, at the bedside, in the field. And that's absolutely true. But there's another version of it. It happens when you become the place where people bring what they can't carry anymore. When you say, "Tell me," and they do. And you actually listen. You don't redirect. You don't sanitize. You don't turn it into something more comfortable. You let it land. And when you do, over and over again, it changes you. It has changed me. I'll be honest with you. This process has left me with scars, not visible ones, but real ones. There are stories I carry now that don't belong to me, but they're with me anyway. There are moments that show up when I don't expect them. There are lines from letters that replay at strange times. And there's a cumulative effect that's hard to describe unless you've felt it. It's not burnout. It's not quite fatigue. It's something else. Lately, I've been calling it crispy. I feel crispy. Not broken, not unable to function, but dried out, like the edges are starting to harden. And when I feel that shift, that subtle movement from empathy towards something sharper, more brittle, that's when I know I need to pay attention, because that's the moment where something important is at risk. Not my ability to do the work, my ability to care the way that the work requires. So I had to figure something out, because the alternative, it's just not sustainable. You can't absorb this volume of human experience without some kind of internal system. And what I realize is this. We talk about triage for patients all the time. We are trained in it. We accept it. We understand that not everything can be treated the same way at the same time with the same resources. But we don't talk about triage for empathy, and we should, because whether we acknowledge it or not, we are all doing it, consciously or unconsciously. And if you don't do it consciously, it'll happen anyway, just not in a way you control. So I started to build a kind of mental triage process, not formal, definitely not academic, just something that helps me stay human in the middle of all of this. The first question I ask myself is, what is mine to carry? Not every story can live in the same level inside you. If everything is equally heavy, you collapse. So I've had to accept that some things I can hold closely and some things I have to hold more lightly. Not because they don't matter, but because I have limits. It's not indifference, it's capacity. If you don't choose what to carry, everything carries you. This one matters because sometimes the question isn't whether you can help, it's whether you're going to carry it all. Recently, a couple of weeks ago, I received an emergency text from a paramedic who was in deep psychological distress and didn't know where to turn for help. He was afraid his colleagues would find out, afraid his employer would find out. So instead of reaching out locally, he went looking for help in another region of the country, somewhere no one would know him. The problem was he didn't know what the resources were there. He was in crisis. He knew it, and I knew it too. That's not something you file away for later. That's not something you say, I'll come back to this when I have more time. Bearing witness wasn't enough. So I did what I used to. I listened, I asked questions, very specific questions, the kind of questions I would have asked if I'd been sitting next to him in the back of an ambulance instead of in my home office. And then I reached out quietly into my network, looking for someone who could help build an intervention plan, not just for the moment, but for what came next. Because that's the part people don't always see. Crisis doesn't end when the immediate danger passes. It just changes shape. I can tell you this, every time an EMS provider reaches out in crisis, it shakes me. Not a little, it shakes me to my core. And there are moments in those conversations where I'm not entirely sure I'm the right person to be holding them. And every time that happens, I find myself reaching for something specific. A mental health toolkit that I keep very deliberately in a well-organized closet in my mind. Because I know if I don't take care of that part of it, I won't be able to do the next one. After we worked through this case, one of the psychologists who helped asked me a question. It really caught me off guard. She said, "Do lost animals find their way to your family?" And I said, "Yes, they do." And she said, "It's because somehow they know they'll find someone who cares." That's the tension. Sorry. Because when you become that person, when people know somehow that you'll care, they don't just bring you what can be witnessed, they bring you what requires action. And if you don't know the difference, you will either fail to act when it matters most, or you will try to act when it's not yours to fix, and both have a cost. The second question is, what requires action and what requires witnessing? Because the instinct, especially in healthcare, is to fix, to intervene, to solve. But a lot of what people bring can't be fixed, not by me, not in that moment. And if you treat everything like a problem to solve, you'll fail constantly. But if you recognize that sometimes your role is simply to witness, to hear, to acknowledge, to validate, that changes the equation. It doesn't make it easier, but it makes it possible. One of the things I've learned through the work surrounding the National Paramedic Monument is that some sacrifices never truly end. This past Sunday, I heard from the mom of Matthew Denny, not a familiar name to all of you. Matthew was a young paramedic from Gatineau, Quebec. In 2012, at the age of 26, the ambulance he was working on was struck head-on by a pickup truck. Matthew survived, but with catastrophic brain injuries. And for 8 years, his family lived inside the aftermath of that crash. Matthew eventually died in 2020 from complications linked to his injuries. And what stayed with me was not just the tragedy itself, it was his mother. Monique continues to speak not only for her son, but for paramedics across this country whose sacrifices are often invisible once the headlines disappear. She speaks about PTSD, about psychological injuries, about the enormous burdens paramedics carry in service to other people. And what struck me was she wasn't asking for the impossible. She wasn't asking anyone to undo what happened to her son. She wasn't asking for a solution. She was asking for recognition, for remembrance, for someone to say, this mattered, he mattered. Before his injury, Matthew was an athlete, a cyclist, a young man with a future moving forward at full speed. Today, pieces of his memory remain scattered through the communities he served. A gymnasium bears his name. A street in La Pêche, Quebec, Place Mathieu Denis, keeps his story in the landscape of the town he called home. And his mother commissioned a small series of commemorative challenge coins bearing his image. Small objects, heavy, heavy meaning. And I realized something through all of that. There was nothing I could do to change what happened to Mathieu Denis. No intervention plan, no system redesign, no quiet phone call in a back hallway. I couldn't fix it. But I could help ensure that what happened to him was not reduced to a statistic or quietly forgotten. And sometimes that's the action. Sometimes witnessing something fully, refusing to let it disappear, is its own form of care. What requires action and what requires witnessing. Because not everything broken can be repaired, but people still need to know that what they carried mattered. The third question is, what needs to be let go on purpose? It's probably the hardest question, because letting something go can feel like abandonment, like you're turning away. But there's a difference between ignoring something and consciously releasing it. There are stories I sit with, and then there are stories I have to say quietly, I hear you. I'll carry this for a moment, but I cannot carry it forever. I don't see that as failure. I see that as survival. I hear from paramedics who were angry years after they left the profession. Some left by choice, some didn't. Career-ending injuries, mental, physical, and they're still there. Not in the job, but in it. They're angry at their employers, and not just frustrated, they're fixated. They're locked into it. The next chapter of their life might as well be hypothetical because they're not living in it. I've read messages from people whose marriages didn't survive that transition, others who are now dependent on alcohol or drugs. And underneath all of it, the common thread is anger. Not passing anger, sustained, focused, the kind that looks for ways to make someone else feel what they felt. And those are the ones that stay with you if you let them, because there's always something in there that could be addressed. A grievance that was never resolved, a recognition that never came, a service medal that was never awarded. And you find yourself thinking, hey, maybe this is the one. Maybe this is where something can shift. But more often than not, even those small openings get swallowed by something heavier, something darker. And at some point I had to recognize something I didn't like. I can listen, and if I'm honest, there are moments where I can feel that anger trying to pull me in. I can hold space, but I can't carry that. So now I do something very deliberate. I hold on to it for a while. I picture it like a duffel bag. I can grab a strap, walk with them for a bit, let them unload what they need to say. But at some point, I let go of the strap because it's their bag. And they're going to move forward with it or not. But I don't get to decide that. Because if you don't do that deliberately, you start carrying things that were never yours to carry. The last question I ask myself is, where am I right now? Am I open or am I starting to close? And I've learned something about that question. I'm not always the best person to answer it. So I've built something around me. I have a few close confidants outside of my family that I check in with every single morning. They know what my days look like. They know what's coming into my inbox. They know the tone, the volume, the unpredictability of it all. One of them has even volunteered to be what we call an email buddy, which means when there's a spike in hate messages, because get those too, they read it first, so I don't have to absorb the worst of it directly. Human triage for email. And each of these people knows me well enough to do something I can't always do for myself. They can look at me or listen to me and tell me the truth. Not gently, definitely not diplomatically, just clearly. Hey, Hal, you're getting crispy. And when that happens, they don't give me a framework. They tell me to pause, go for a walk, step away, put something else in my head, music, silence, anything that interrupts the pattern. And I listen because I've learned something the hard way. If I wait until I can feel it clearly myself, I've already gone too far. Where am I right now? Not where I think I am, not where I'd like to be, where I actually am. And sometimes the only way to answer that honestly is to let someone else tell you. So I pay attention, and when I feel that word, crispy, start to apply, I intervene. Not with a protocol, with something very simple. I leave, literally. I change my environment. I step out of the loop. Because sometimes the only way to reset your perspective is to physically remove yourself from what's shaping it. It's not dramatic, it's not complicated, but it works. So I come back to those 4 questions, not because they're perfect, because they work. And here's what I've learned. If you ask them consistently, honestly, you don't lose your ability to care. You stay open, on purpose. And when you don't, something else takes over. That's when the edges harden. That's when distance creeps in. That's when you become crispy. So maybe the goal isn't to avoid that feeling. Maybe the goal is to recognize it early for what it actually is. It's not failure. It's a signal that you've been carrying too much for too long without a system. Because this work, whether you're on the truck, behind a console, in an office, in a hospital, or somewhere in between, it follows you. The front line is not a place you leave. It's something you carry. And the question is whether you carry it consciously or whether it carries you. And if we get that part right, maybe we don't just survive this work. Maybe we stay in it fully, with intention, and not crispy. Thank you.